Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PMP exam preparation training program. Today's training is a special training because today we are going to talk about some of the questions that you might face in the PMP exam or the questions that you might face during your project management interview. So, therefore, today's session is going to be completely focused on the different questions and the various answers to those questions. We are going to discuss those out, the various options for each of the questions, and we'll identify the best answer to the question. Of course, we'll discuss various options that are given and we'll try and understand why the selected answer is the best answer for that respective question. So I welcome you all to this PMP exam question session. So let's start this session by having bit of an understanding in terms of the PMP certification. I'm sure you will agree that the PMP certification is one of the globally acknowledged professional certification as far as the project management is concerned. And of course, we all know that PMP, which is offered by PMI, and PMI offers different certifications, including PMP and PGMP, which is for the program management. And PMP certification is definitely one of the globally acknowledged and recognized certification. It also legalizes a professional education experience in project management because when you'll appear for the PMP certification as a part of the prerequisite, as a part of the criteria, you will need to demonstrate your experience in project management. Not only that, you will also have to furnish enough credentials in order to prove your education that is required as per the prerequisite to complete the PMP prerequisite for appearing for the PMP examination. So in a way, this helps in legalizing a professional education and experience in project management, which definitely helps. Another important thing that you must have observed is that the PMP certified project managers can command almost 25% more salary than their peers. So this definitely gives you an edge over other colleagues and peers. When you appear for the interview, I have seen that most of the job description these days, they specifically highlight about if you're appearing for the project management role, then they specifically highlight that we are looking out for somebody who is certified project manager or certified PMP. So PMP certificate is definitely very prestigious and is considered to be the golden standard of project management. So I will definitely welcome you all to this session in which we'll be talking about a lot on the PMP and specifically with respect to the questions. Let's talk about the PMP job opportunities. Why these days I have seen so many people appearing for the PMP examination, and the reason is very clear. If you see the statistics is basically comparing 2070's data versus what's going to come, what we will be seeing by 2027. And you can see on the screen very clearly that the PMP job opportunities are just going to rise many folds in comparison to 2017 by the end of 2027. And this trend is definitely growing. So certified project managers will definitely have a lot of opportunities from the job point of view. One of the advantage that you will get as a certified project managers is that you can actually do the project management irrespective of the domain that you're working in, because the project management PMP certification actually endorses your project management experience irrespective of the domain. So job opportunities, as you can see in China and India and US, across various countries in the world, they are actually going to grow up many folds by 2017. Not only that, the project manager role-wise salary band, if you take a look at on the screen, you will realize that when you will begin your career as a project manager and when you will go up in the ladder, you'll find that the salary band is just going to widen up as you grow in your project management career. And when you'll complete your PMP certification, that's going to give a lot of value add to your credentials. And when you will grow in your career ladder, one of the important pillars will be your PMP certification. So with this, we'll get on to the actual session of questions and answer. Let's get started with the first question. There are some basic questions. There are certain scenario based questions. On the top of that, we have also a few questions which are identified where we'll be solving some of the examples that will be asked in the PMP examination. So let's get started with the first question. The first question to you all is define project scope. So when you define project scope, there are various options that we can think of. The first option is it is design of experiments that is used to complete the project work. It is the combination of cost and the schedule which is required to complete the project work. It is a description of the required work that is necessary to complete the project. It is a description of the required work and resources that are needed to complete the project. So if you talk about the scope of the project, when we define while working on the project, it's definitely the description of the required work that is necessary to complete the project. Now, please understand that sometimes these options could be a bit confusing. When you'll appear for the PMP examination, you'll find out of the 4 options, 2 options are very, very close. Here also you'll find that the option number third and the option number fourth, they appears to be very close. But here definitely there is a difference that if you see the fourth option, it says it is the description of the required work and resources that are needed to complete the project. But if you talk about project scope, doesn't talk about the resources needed. Project scope talk about only the work to be performed on the project. So resources needed will need to be determined based on the project scope, and that is definitely covered as a part of the scope management process. So the answer is the third answer here. Moving to the next question, it talks about what is a program. Now, we did cover this as a part of the training as well, as you all know. We have options here. Program, a very large and complex project, a collection of projects which have common resources, a collection of sub-projects having a common goal, and a collection of sub-projects having a common customer. Now, if you remember what we discussed and learned about program, it basically talks about the collection of projects which have common resources. So if you take a look at the different levels that we talk about, so it all starts by having a clear-cut strategy at the organization level, and that might be within some portfolio. Then your portfolio gets divided into various programs, and within program you will find different projects. So ultimately it is a set, or it is basically a collection of projects, and these projects are basically segregated under the common goal under that portfolio that we talk about. So that's nothing but your program. So therefore the correct answer is a program is a collection of projects which have common resources. Let's move ahead to the next question. Which of the following comprises the project lifecycle? So we discussed about project lifecycle, which comprises of various phases. I'm sure you will agree that here the answer is phases. The project lifecycle and product lifecycle is different. Within a product lifecycle, you may be doing various projects. There are multiple projects that are involved. And to launch that product, you may have undertaken a project. Because as we saw in the definition of the project, by the end of the project, what we get is a product or service or some outcome that we get. So definitely we undertake a project in order to produce a product, but the product life cycle is different altogether. It's pretty longer life cycle, and you may undertake various projects within a life cycle of a product. But project life cycle will have various phases. Phases like if you take example of software delivery life cycle, then you would agree that we start with initiation, then we start gathering requirements, then we analyze those requirements, we design them, we build them, we test them, and then we deploy. So there are various phases that are involved as a part of the project lifecycle. Milestones are going to be part of the various phases. By the end of the phase, we achieve some milestone. And estimation is one of the activities that we perform when we break down our scope item into various activities, and we estimate that activity in terms of duration, in terms of cost, and then that actually helps us in determining overall budget for the project, and for that matter the duration as well. And activities, as we just discussed, the phase can get split into various activities as we go on performing them. All right, so a project life cycle will have various phases into it. Let's move to the next question. Being the project manager of the ABC project, you have allowed subsequent project phase to begin even before the predecessor phase completes. Which of the following relates to this scenario? Now, there are concepts like crashing and fast tracking. While working on the project, we have to take certain corrective decisions and certain preventive decisions. So one of the decisions that we take, considering the way progress has been going on the project, of course, by analyzing various metric, we take decisions like let's fast track the project or crash the project. So when we say fast track, we actually start activities in parallel, And when we say crashing, we actually put more resources to the activity so that we can complete that activity fast. But of course, crashing has its own disadvantage and it actually increases a lot of project risk. Plus, most importantly, since in crashing, you're actually putting more resources, that means there is more cost involved. So apart from risk, the cost involvement is also on a higher side, and therefore, usually on the project, people go for fast tracking. So that's what exactly is mentioned in this scenario. So this covers the fast tracking scenario. Of course, risk management is definitely nowhere near, and tandem scheduling is given just sometimes to confuse the participants. So the correct answer is fast tracking. Moving to the next question then, the person or group providing the resources and support for the project, program or portfolio and is also responsible for enabling success is called as, who is that person who is really involved into so many such a activity? Is it the project manager? But if you see, project manager may not be involved at a portfolio level or may not be involved at a program level. What about senior manager? Senior manager is just the designation, right? Is that really the role that we're talking about here? Or is that really a person that we're talking about here? What about the sponsor and the clients? There are two other options that are given. But if you see from the project point of view, the appropriate answer here is the sponsor, because sponsor is the one who is actually going to provide you all the resources and support that is required. Sponsor is the one who actually gives you the project charter and thereby empowers you to use the resources on the project. And therefore, it's the sponsor who is ultimately the one who is going to provide the resources and support for project, program, and portfolio. The next question is, which of the following cannot be the part of group activity techniques? Now, there are various group activity techniques that are conducted, and I'm sure some of you can recall the ones that we covered as part of this training, like brainstorming, affinity diagram, nominal group technique. You may have already been a part of some brainstorming session. So brainstorming session could be done to solve a problem or think creatively, come up with various ideas, etc. And once we have list of ideas, then what we do essentially, we use affinity diagram, right? We just try to group the ideas, whichever the ideas which belong to a particular category, we try to group them by creating the affinity diagram. Nominal group technique builds on that. And nominal group techniques actually helps us in involving participants a bit more and getting votes from the participant in order to shortlist the best possible idea. So these three things are definitely going hand in hand with the group creativity technique. But one thing looks to be completely odd here, which is vendor bid analysis. And therefore, it's very clear now that if this question, if you read, sometimes this question could be very confusing because I have seen people do not read it clearly and we might just miss that word not. So if you read it carefully, it says, which of the following cannot be the part of the group activity technique? So some of these questions are very tricky because I have seen sometimes if you miss that not, then you may answer it wrongly. And because we're talking about here, which is not a part of the group activity technique, and that's now very clear after our discussion that it's the vendor bid analysis. Moving from here, we'll go to another scenario based question. Being the project manager of the thermal power plant project, you need to manage the construction of an administrative unit building. Which of the following technique will you use to quickly estimate and decide the use of historic estimate and expert judgment? Now, if you recall the estimation techniques that we had gone through several estimation techniques like bottom-up estimation or the PERT formula, etc. Another examples which are mentioned here on the screen like analogous estimation, parametric, historical, expert judgment. Analogous estimation talks about basically building on the historical information that you already have in the organization, maybe as a part of the organizational process assets. Every organization will have their process assets. As a part of that, they build a lot of information within the organization, which is very useful when we do the estimation. Now, expert judgment is asking some of the SMEs, some experts about their opinion in terms of the estimation. Historical estimation, we again compare it with the historical information about the project that is available. Similar kind of a project, similar complexity, similar size, etc. Parametric estimation, here is what we talk about the various parameters, which are units, and then we try to understand the number of units that are required. Like in software, for example, I have seen people using various levels of skill. At the expert level, in the team member, for example, if I have got expert skill, so how long that expert skill member takes to code a particular complexity of the code. So we divide code complexity to low, medium, and high, and we've got a different levels of skill levels, right? So these are the various parameters I'm taking into consideration, and based on that, I'm estimating how long would it take for that developer to complete the coding activity. All right. Similarly, analogous estimation. This is where we factor in a couple of things. One is, of course, historical information that is available in the organization. On the top of that, we ask experts. Why do we ask expert? Because that historical information may not be enough to come up with a very clear estimation. Of course, analogous estimation itself is a high level estimation, and it's very useful when we have to go back to the client with some number. And in order to be a bit better in terms of what we are estimating, in analogous estimation, what we do is historical estimation and the expert judgment is in a way combined. So we try to gather information of the similar kind of a project that is done in the past, and we also take opinion from the expert. So we combine that, and then we go back to the client with the estimation. So therefore, the answer is the analogous estimation. Let's move on to the next question then. This question is about what is the acceptable range used for determining the realistic activity cost estimation. Now we are talking about cost estimation here, and that is to at an activity level. So if you take a look at various techniques that we covered, one of the technique that we saw was the PERT technique that I mentioned to you. So which is done at an activity level. And for each of the activities, we try to understand the estimation based on the PERT formula, which covers about your most likely estimation, your optimistic estimation, your pessimistic estimation, and then you put it in a formula and then you kind of estimate it. So in terms of level of accuracy, because it's a bottom-up approach, we are doing the activity level cost estimation. Definitely, we are talking about getting a better level of accuracy here. All right. So the answer is definitely the level of accuracy is what we try to arrive at when we try to understand the acceptable range used for determining the realistic activity cost estimate, because we take into consideration optimistic, pessimistic, various such options. This is just one example if you're using a PERT, or even there are other options that I have seen. For example, ballpark estimation or rough order of magnitude. So the range of estimation is very high. So that means we are just trying to find here the level of accuracy. It's not about the precision. So precision will come when we try to round up the estimation. And that's where the precision will come in. So it's the level of accuracy is the right answer over here. Let's now take one example and try to solve that. So this question is about calculating the schedule performance index. So this question is, what is the schedule performance index of a software development project where earned value is $6,000, planned value is $5,000, and actual cost is $4,000? So to solve this, what we'll do is we'll take a quick look at the numbers and we'll of course use the formula. Just so that we can do it quickly, I have copied that entire question over here in the Excel sheet so that we can calculate it. And what I would suggest is when you will actually do it in the examination, I would suggest to one thing. When you enter into exam and when you will get the blank sheet of paper, the first thing that you will be doing is try to translate whatever you will remember, all the formulas that you'll remember on that piece of paper, and keep it ready. So that during the sums, when you actually solve these various examples, then you should not struggle to recall the formula. All right. So let's presume that you have already jotted down all the formulas like this. Okay. So all the key formula you have already jotted down, something like this. All right. So like present value, or for that matter, various estimation formula like PERT or standard deviation, variance, etc. Or for that matter, the other formula which will be helpful to you in calculating the earned value analysis, cost variance, schedule variance, right? Or estimate at completion, estimate to complete. So all these, some of the key formulas that we are talking about: variance at completion, schedule performance index, cost performance index. Sometimes there could be a question on TCPI, which is to complete performance index. Again, we need to understand which approach should I be using. Is it based on the estimate at completion, or is it based on the budget at completion? So accordingly, we'll have to use the formula. Similarly, for total float, what is the formula? Communication channels, you can expect one question on communication channels. Likewise, these are some of the key formulas which are expected to be written down when you reach there. The first thing that you'll be doing is that you'll be actually putting these formulas down on a piece of paper so that these formulas will be ready when you will try to solve the questions. So this is the question where we are trying to calculate the SPI, which is Schedule Performance Index of a software development project. Now, I just refer to this sheet where I have jotted down all the formulas, and I pick up the formula which is required for Schedule Performance Index, which is earned value divided by planned value. That means to get the Schedule Performance Index, I need to have earned value, I need to have planned value. So I first check into the question, do I have these two values to calculate SPI? So when I take a look at the question, I see here, this is pretty straightforward question that way. So I have got earned value, which is $6,000, and I have planned value, which is $5,000. So that means calculating SPI will become just a straightforward affair. So what do? I just divide earned value by planned value. So I get 1.2. So SPI of 1.2, that means my planned value, my earned value is more than the planned value, which is definitely a good situation to have. SPI and CPI, which is Cost Performance Index and Schedule Performance Index, should be more than 1. If it is more than 1, then it is good. That means we are ahead of schedule. So the answer to this question is 1.2, and we are ahead of schedule, which is definitely a good situation to be in when we are working on the project. So with that quick example, let's move on to some other topic now. The question on costing. The question is, cost baseline is the output of which of the following? So there are various processes that we have to work through when we work on the PMP certification preparation. And just to let you know, just so that you would agree in terms of the number of processes that we have to understand and go through. So we have got various such processes, right? So we have process groups like initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, closing. And we have knowledge areas. There are 10 of them, starting with integration management to the stakeholder management. And there are total 49 processes within these process groups and the knowledge areas. So this particular question is referring to the cost baseline. So that means this should be a part of the cost management. So under cost management, if you take a look at, we have got certain processes that we have to work on, like plan cost management, estimate cost, determine budget, and control cost. These are the 4 processes which makes the project cost management. Now, what are the options given here? So cost baseline is output of what? So one is plan cost management. So plan cost management is the process in itself, right? So as we see here, plan cost management is one process option, which is fine. Second is estimate cost. Estimate cost is another option that is there. Determine budget. Okay, that's another process. And control cost. That means the option contains all the 4 processes. So then confusion rises. Now, if you apply here logic, it's pretty straightforward that I'm talking here about cost baselining. So I will be doing baselining only when I will determine budget, which is based on the activity and the duration. If you remember, hence we are talking about cost here. So obviously we're talking about the money part. So we're talking about a cost estimation here based on the activities. So if you think logically, then obviously we don't do that as a part of the planning. So in plan cost management, we are just creating the plan. In estimate cost process, we'll be focusing on estimating cost for each of the activities that we have divided our WBS into. Determine budget. So control, again, we don't do control part will not involve coming up with a cost baseline. So that means the option that I see correct here is determine budget. So I'll be able to work on the determine budget only when I have the cost for each of the activities, and I just sum up them up, the cost for each of the activities in order to determine budget, and then I'll get cost baseline. So that means cost baseline output should come from determine budget. So that's how I look at it when I try to solve questions. So I hope that hint must have given you some idea about how we can go by. So we have got 2 options here. Either you know the exact answer, or we have to then go on eliminating the different options that are given. So if you just go on eliminating the options, then we arrive at the right option. So let's move on from there to the next question. The next question talks about, suppose you are the project manager on a thermal power plant project. How will you manage your team members if there is a difference in opinion over the design of turbine? So this is a thermal project and you're working on the design part. There are various options that are given. One is you will organize meeting to solve misunderstanding and agree on a common solution. Other is defer the decision to procure turbine components as much as possible because there is dispute. Copy the design of turbine from a similar past project. procure the turbine parts from the nearest local vendor. Now, if you think logically again here, we are talking about the difference of opinion over design of turbine. So if I go by elimination, then obviously I can't just because there is a difference of opinion, I can't just go to some nearby vendor and procure it, right? Or if you take a look at copy the design of turbine from similar past project, just because of difference of opinion, I don't think so I should be taking such an extreme decision. Or defer the decision. Again, if you defer the decision, it's going to affect your schedule, it's going to affect your cost. And that is something which you will never like as a project manager. That means only relevant option here that I see is organize meeting to solve misunderstanding and agree to a common solution. And therefore, the best thing to do in such a scenario is confrontation. So we need to confront as a team. And constructive disagreements are good. Constructive disagreements only help us in arriving at the good solution. So when we confront to the disagreements of each other, I'm sure that it could be a consensus and you will see a common solution, you will see a common goal, and collectively you might just choose the best possible option out of the discussion and move ahead. The next question talks about if you find that an activity in your project is very risky, how will you estimate the duration of this activity when your team member has given the optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic duration for the activity? So, if you remember, I told you about the PERT formula. So, PERT formula is all about determining by taking into consideration the various estimations. So, we talk about pessimistic, optimistic, and we talk about most likely. So let's take a look at these formulas. So there are a couple of formulas here from the PERT. So one is of course the triangular distribution and the another is beta distribution. So generally we use beta if in case it's not specifically mentioned. So as per the beta distribution, what we talk about is, so we have pessimistic, optimistic and most likely. So formula is like this. So we have pessimistic plus 4 into most likely plus optimistic divided by 6. So this is the PERT formula that I'll be using for each of the activities. And then I just go on adding them up in order to get the project duration, since we're talking about duration here. So that means I'm going to use the PERT formula here very clearly. So this is pretty straightforward. Don't get into complications or don't get into any kind of a confusion here. So if you remember the PERT formula, you should be able to very straightforward answer this question. So let's then move on to the next question here. This is based on some other topic which we haven't touched yet. So this talk about leadership theories, etc. Which among the following is not valid according to McGregor's theory X? So if you remember our discussion about the various leadership theories, one of the theory that we covered as a part of this training was McGregor's theory X. So which focuses on few things. It focuses on employee self-motivation. And if you recall that discussion, so we have got theory X and we have theory Y. So if you talk about these two things here, you will agree that we are talking about the employee self-motivation as a part of theory X. So again, this is pretty straightforward. And if you just recall some of the key points under the McGregor's theory, you should be able to answer this question very, very clearly. So here, the last option is the correct option. The theory X will talk about employee are self-motivated. So if you take a look at McGregor's theory, in fact, let me just take a look at this. Some of the examples we have already taken as a part of this training, and some examples will be taking up as we go ahead. All right, so if you talk about the various theories that we covered as a part of the training, you would agree that one of the theory that we spoke on is McGregor's theory X. So just recall the discussion that we had and try to remember it by some techniques that what theory X talks about, some of the key points, and then that should certainly be able to help you in answering it. I have seen that usually on the leadership theories, the questions are very, very straightforward. The next question talks about you are the project manager on a software development project. Your CPI drops to 0.93 when one of your key developers suddenly fall ill. To make up for your affected work, you have decided to outsource it to a vendor. What will be the most appropriate contract type in this case? So if you talk about different contract types under the procurement knowledge area that we covered, you'll realize that first of all, you have to understand the fact the CPI is below 1. That means your cost performance index is not doing good. You are actually utilizing more money than budgeted, as simple as that. So in this scenario, which contract type will help you in order to make sure that you're controlling your cost? So retainage is not certainly a contract type as such. So retainage is retainage is all about just retaining money. So if you are the buyer and you're dealing with the seller, so what typically happens as a buyer, we retain some amount at times. We don't pay everything upfront, just so that as per the contract, whatever is agreed, the seller will perform that work. And before that, we don't release all the money. So we retain some part of the money. It's just a part of the contract. It's not the contract in itself, really. The another option here which is given is FPEPA. So what is FPEPA is another contract type. So this talks about one of the contract that we covered even as a part of the training. And this particular contract we talk about the fixed price with economic price adjustment contract. So in this particular contract, we talk about paying the fixed price and then adjusting the price based on the economic changes that are happening. So here, I don't think so this could be applicable if you agree with me, because you're in a scenario wherein you need something very, very quickly. The last option is definitely not a contract, which is letter of intent, which is not a contract. So the only option which is applicable here is cost reimbursable contract. And I'm sure you'll agree that cost reimbursable contract is the one which will help you in working through this particular scenario, because you're already spending more than the budgeted cost considering the current CPI. Moving from there, let's take a look at another scenario here. The next question is, who among the following said people will be interested in their safety needs only after their physiological needs have been fulfilled? So I think this thing you must have also learned. If some of you have done MBAs, you must have learned about different theories. Even I've seen some of these theories are covered these days as a part of different leadership training programs. So you must have heard about this needs theory, the different levels of needs that we talk about, the physiological needs, and then we ultimately talk about the need which will fulfill the nirvana stage wherein everything is kind of fulfilled. So different levels of need. And if you recall, that's called as Maslow's theory of needs hierarchy. So there are various hierarchy of needs which are basically explained in this theory. If you talk about McGregor, so McGregor, we just spoke about theory X and Y. So it's not related. Hensberg theory again talks about completely something else. Oichi is not really covered as part of, I don't think so, is going to be covered under any of the theories typically that we covered under PMP. So the only thing that is left is Maslow's needs of hierarchy theory. So that's how we can go by the rejection of choices in order to arrive at the most appropriate option. So moving from there, let's take a look at another question here. So this question talks about WBS is an excellent and most effective tool that is used for tracking. Now, what do we track really through WBS? So do we track the resources? I don't think so. Do we track the schedule? WBS will not help in tracking schedule as such. WBS can help you in determining schedule once we do the estimation, etc. What about project risk? I don't think so. In tracking risk, it will help you. So the only option that is left is the scope. So WBS will help you in coming up with the project scope. So one of the things that we make sure is that WBS contains only the scope item to be worked upon in that project. And that is very, very important. So in a way, it's kind of a traceability. We make sure that whatever is in WBS is delivered by the end of the project. So that means your requirement specification document should be translated into WBS very, very clearly, because that's ultimately going to be the final scope which is factored in or considered in the project. The another question talks about the organizational structure. The question is the best project organization structure for a small but highly technical project will be which one? So here we're talking about a small technical project, a small organization. Which one would be better? So if you remember the various structures that we had gone through, like for example, just to give you a very quick idea about the kind of structures that we had gone through, as you can see here, so we talk about the functional organization, then we talk about other organizations like weak matrix, we talk about balance matrix, we covered about even the strong matrix organizations, and for that matter, the projectized organization. The structure is based on the projects and then staff is aligned to the project. Likewise, the another structure that we covered was the composite organization. So this is like mixture here, as you can see, the composite of both. So we have project manager as well as we have staff here, but it's also project managers. Function itself is different. So even this kind of structure we have covered as a part of this training. So if you take a look at which one would be more suitable for this kind of environment, the situation is the organization is small and it's highly technical project. So because it's a technical project, so if you take a look at the functional structure would be more suitable to this kind of organization, because we're talking about arranging people with the different functions. So we can have developer, we can have so people who are working in designing, people who are working in requirement. So with a specific function in which the people are working in, we can organize the organization. So the correct option here is the functional structure, because we're talking about the technical project, we're talking about the expertise here. And then of course, once you have a functional structure, then you can still execute the project, right? And we discussed about that, how to go about doing it. So from there, now we'll move to the another question. This is a scenario based question. Now in the examination, you'll be asked scenario based question, straightforward question, and of course there will be examples to solve as well. So what we are taking here as a part of this session is combination of all this. Being a project manager is you need to manage a project where there will be a number of persons working together. If you want to enhance the ability of the team to work together and perform as a team, which of the following things you would need to do maximum the ability of the team? So you're talking about here team working together. So in order to enhance the ability of the team to work together, or maybe the high performance team, or maybe the team which is able to deliver the better outcome. So for that, I'm sure you will agree that the co-location is the best option, because work breakdown structure has nothing to do with the ability of the team here. Staffing plan is just about plan, but we are expecting action over here. Cohabitation is too extreme. I don't think so. We need to get into that. So here the straightforward answer is co-location. When the team member are co-located, sitting together, talking to each other, they'll be able to establish good rapport, good bonding, and they'll be able to start performing as a team. They'll be able to go through the team formation phases of forming, storming, norming, performing, and finally adjourning. So those TechMan's team formation phases, they could able to go through, and the ability of the team could be then developed faster. Let's move to the next question. What is the role of the change control board? So one of the process that we talk about is the change control process. And as a part of that, there is a change control board which needs to be established. So let's go through the options. The first option talks about assessing the impact of the change on project objectives. Second is defining requirements for the customer, doing performance appraisal for team members involved in implementing change, encouraging team members to raise more change requests. I think this is pretty straightforward. I'm sure you'll agree that change control board will be involved into assessing impact of change on the project objectives. That's the primary responsibility of the change control board. They will understand the impact on cost, impact on schedule, impact on architecture, impact on design, impact on the other aspect of the project. And based on that, the decision will be made whether to accept that change or reject. Now let's take a look at the another question here. This talks about being the project manager on a STP project. You decide to respond to identified risk by contracting out work. Which of the following will lead to the minimum risk of buyer? Now here we are talking about different contracts. If you talk about various contracts, you will agree that we have various contracts. Like, let's take a look at some of the contracts that we covered as a part of this training. And even for that matter, from the risk point of view, which contract will pose more risk? So we have a buyer and we have a seller. So from the buyer point of view, which now here the question is from the buyer point of view. So if you are a buyer, then which contract will pose more risk? So as a buyer, you'll find that risk is low here and risk is very, very high when you go ahead. So here, if you read the question again, you will realize being the project manager on a STP project, you decide to respond to an identified risk by contracting out. Which of the following will lead to the minimum risk of buyer? So if you see, the minimum risk on buyer is going to be the firm fixed price contract. There are other contracts also which we covered, right? Cost plus percentage of cost, or cost plus fixed fee, or cost plus incentive fees. But if there is a fixed fee or fixed price, then obviously on the buyer, the risk is very, very low, because risk is actually borne by the seller by developing whatever is the scope item within that fixed price. So that's how you can look at this question. So firm fixed price is the right answer here. Next question is, for which process the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix is prepared as a part? So which process will involve the stakeholder assessment matrix here? There are various options. The first is identify stakeholder. Second is manage stakeholder engagement. Third is control stakeholder engagement. And the last is plan stakeholder management. Now we are talking about here the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. So as a part of this, if you see, this can't be done during the first, which is identify stakeholder. This can't be done when we are managing the stakeholder. It has to be ready before that. This can't be done as a part of control. Again, it has to be ready before that. So the best way to develop that is during planning. So when we are planning the stakeholder management, that time we should come up with the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, right? So this assessment matrix will help me in identifying the as is state of a stakeholder, and then I can come up with the to be stage. So as is stage of the stakeholder could be he is resistant, he is not really pro change, and then I have to move from the resistant state to the state where he can start cooperating, he can start responding, he can start engaged, he can start involving in the project. So this particular assessment matrix needs to be prepared as a part of the planning, the stakeholder management itself. So the correct answer is plan stakeholder management. Next question talks about being a project manager, you need to spend a significant amount of time in communications. Which of the following option contains the three basic elements of a communication model? Now think from the communication point of view. Another easy question to score. We have options like verbal, non-verbal, written. The another option is sender, receiver, message. Next is text, drawing, picture. The last is manager, worker, instruction. So obviously, as a project manager, if you talk about, I'm sure the last two options you can still easily eliminate. Out of the next two options, if we talk about here, the communication mode. So when we talk about communication mode, we are talking about the sender, receiver, and the message. So coding, encoding, and the actual message which is transmitted. So we've already covered this as a part of the communication management itself. So sender, receiver, and the message is the right answer over here. Next question is, suppose you are assigned as the project manager of a 30-month project which is in the executing phase. What will be the best way to resolve a conflict among the technical experts in your team? So this question basically focuses on the conflict resolution techniques, etc. So various options are there. You are resolving the conflict. The options are find the root cause of the disagreement, resolve the conflict in favor of the senior most technical expert, hire an external consultant to enforce this decision, remove this technical work from the scope of the project work. So I think some of the options we can easily eliminate, right? We can't remove the scope of the work. So that option has gone. Can we hire an external consultant for this really? I mean, people will not trust the external consultant to solve the conflict. So obviously that option is kind of ruled out. What about resolving conflict in favor of technical expert? That's against the values of the organization and for that matter, the team and, in general as well. So the only option that is left then to find the root cause of the disagreement and confront it. As we mentioned earlier, confrontation is the best technique to solve conflict and disagreements. Moving to the next question, what should be your primary concern while adding resources to your project? Now, when we add resources to the project, obviously I need to understand its impact. So let's take a look at the options. The first option is effect of adding resources on project end date. So this takes care of only schedule. Second option is effect of adding resources on S-curve. S-curve is the cost curve, which we covered as a part of the cost management. The next option is effect of adding resources on RAM, which is the resource assignment matrix that we talk about, and effect of adding resources on cost and schedule. So if you take a look at when we add any resources, now please understand from the PMBOK 6th edition point of view, resources are not just about people. It's about any resources that are used on the project. So it's going to be even the material resources, machineries, all of that, and not just people. So when we add resources, the first thing that we need to take into consideration is how that resource is going to impact my cost, how that resource is going to impact my schedule. So that means the option which is correct is the last option here. Let's move to the next question. If John is working with his team to decide the degree to which cost estimate should be rounded up or down, then he is working to establish which of the following: units of measure, level of precision, level of accuracy, and controls threshold. So if you remember, I did mention this earlier when we were talking about the estimation range. So that time I mentioned if we're doing the rounding off, we're talking about the precision because we're trying to be precise by doing the rounding off of the estimation. So this is again pretty straightforward. if you know the definition of precision and the accuracy, then you should be able to get this correct. So maybe try and read and understand the difference between precision and accuracy. Let's move to the next question then. Being a project manager, how will you deal with a stakeholder who has high power and high interest? So if you remember the stakeholder matrix, we prepare various stakeholder metric. From the stakeholder's point of view, you will agree that we take into consideration few things. Like we take into consideration power to interest. We take into consideration interest to power. So here we are talking about a stakeholder which has got high power and high interest. So if you talk about power and interest and both are high, that means we need to manage these stakeholders effectively. So if you see the options here, do I need to keep them satisfied or do I need to just keep them informed or monitor? No, because we are talking about a stakeholder with high power and high interest. That means I need to manage the stakeholder closely. So that's the right answer here. Next question is, while estimating the cost of work in a very new technology, being a project manager, which of the following will concern you the most? If you take a look at some of these options, you're new to the technology and you're trying to estimate how long would it take. So what will concern you the most? First is, of course, lack of quality policy. I don't think so that's relevant really. Lack of communication management plan, again, doesn't seem to be relevant from estimation point of view. Internet connection not reliable. All right, so that's completely outlier here. Lack of historical information. I agree. The lack of historical information, because if I'm working on something which is completely new to me, I rely on the organizational process assets. And if there is similar kind of a project done in the past, I might just use analogous estimation and based on that quickly estimate about the project. Let's take an example now, a different question where we'll try to solve some example. The example is like this. A road project was planned to be completed in 8th month. Calculate the schedule variance when the earned value information at the end of 6th month is given as the budgeted completion, which is $8,000. Actual cost was $12,000. Percentage completion was 100%. Now, this is interesting. Let's try to solve this particular example. So I have already copied that into this Excel sheet so that we'll be able to do the calculation. Now, if you take a look at this, we're trying to solve here. What are we trying to solve here? We're trying to identify the schedule variance. So the first thing that I will do is I will refer to my list of formulas that I've written and try to come up with what is the formula for schedule variance. So schedule variance is earned value minus planned value, right? So what is earned value? Earned value is nothing but what is my actual completion percentage to the budgeted completion. So my planned budget is here $8,000, and what is my actual completion? 100%. That means my earned value, can I say that my earned value and actual completion is 100%? That means that my earned value is equal to BAC. So BAC is equal to my earned value. The another option is planned value. So how can I calculate my planned value? The planned value was planned completion percentage. So my planned completion percentage, how would I calculate that? So I supposed to complete this project in 8 months. However, I did it in just 6 months. That means as per my original plan, I'm supposed to be completing 75% of the project by now. So 75% of the BAC comes to 6,000. So can I say that is my planned value? 6,000. So now I have got my planned value, which is 6,000, and I've got my earned value, which is my budget at completion, because I have completed the project 100%. So I earned the value there. So 8,000 minus 6,000 is 2,000. So 2,000 is my schedule variance. So this is how I can calculate the schedule variance of in this scenario. Let's take another example. What will be incentive amount for a contractor who is working on a cost plus incentive fee contract? The project's target cost is $5,000 with a target fee of $800. Minimum fee is $500 and the maximum fee is $1,000. Also, the buyer-seller share ratio is 80-20 with an actual cost of $6,000. So this is the number. Now, if you recall the formula, so again, you will make sure that you will write down the formula in the beginning itself so that you would have the formula at least ready. So what we are talking about here is calculating the incentive. So this particular contract, take a look at this contract. This is cost plus incentive fee contract. Now, in this particular contract, what do we do? So we have a buyer and a seller. So buyer will get into this contract with the seller, and the buyer will reimburse the cost to the seller, whatever the actual cost that is involved. On the top of that, some incentives are paid. Now, there are chances that seller might just take the advantage of this. So in order to ensure that this contract is balanced up and to make sure that the project cost is controlled at the same time project is also completed within time or ahead of time, there are certain elements that are attached to this. And those elements are nothing but either we pay the incentives or we penalize the seller, or at the same time, if we complete the work ahead of schedule, then we of course also pay the incentives. So how the incentive calculation is done? Let's take a look at this. So before that, you must have realized here there are certain numbers already given. So target cost is given, target fee is given. Let's take a look at some of these numbers. What are they basically? So if you talk about sharing ratio, 80-20 sharing ratio, the sharing ratio is buyer to seller. So 80% is for buyer, 20% is for the seller. It's always buyer to seller ratio. Remember that. So this is how the ratio is shared between buyer and a seller. Target cost is the expected cost. So how much the project would cost. So that's the expected cost of the project. Target fees, again, the expected fees that the seller will get. So seller is primarily working to get the fee in doing the project. Plus there is expectation of an incentive fee. Now what is the maximum fee? This is basically the maximum incentive the seller can expect to get. Of course, it's going to be associated with the performance and the sharing ratio, which is 80-20 in this case. Minimum fee is of course the minimum incentive fees the seller will get for meeting the requirements set in the contract. And there is of course a formula which we just now covered. So formula talks about, so we have all these numbers. So we have target cost, we have target fee, we have minimum fee, maximum fee, and we have got a buyer seller ratio as well as the actual cost. So to calculate incentive, what we have basically, the formula is target cost minus actual cost into seller's sharing ratio. To calculate the incentives, what do we do? So I've got a target cost which is 5,000 and my actual cost is 6,000, which is not a good scenario. If you see, what is my target cost? The project is going to cost me 5,000. That was expected in the beginning. But what is actual cost? Actually, it costed 6,000. And if I minus this, I'm getting, of course, minus $1,000. And on the top of that, the seller ratio is 20%. What I get as a part of the incentive is minus 200 in this case. So the answer to this question is minus 200 because my actual cost is more than the cost of the expected cost that I've put in the beginning of the contract. Now you could go ahead and try to arrive at the final fee also. For doing that, you can just add the target fee. So target fee, which is 800. So if you add that, then you can give final fee of 600. Or you can also come up with a final reimbursed cost. How much would it be? So from the contract point of view, I will have to give seller the actual cost plus the incentive fee, the final incentive fee. Actually, incentives are minus $200, but the final incentives are coming to 600 by adding the target fee. So that's 600 plus I have to pay the actual cost. That means the final reimbursement cost will be $6,600, but the incentives are actually minus 200. So that's how I look at things in this case. So what is important here is understanding these terms, and of course you need to have the formula handy so that you can solve this question. Moving from there to the next question. This question is about which of the following a resource histogram shows but a responsibility assignment matrix does not. So if you talk about resource histogram and the responsibility assignment matrix, so there are a few options that are given here, but the correct answer is time, because you'll find that the responsibility assignment matrix will not cover up the time. It will talk about activities, its interrelationships, and whom that activity is assigned to. The histogram will talk about the time. So that's the difference you'll find here. Moving to the next question, which of the following is used to display sensitivity analysis? Now, when you do the sensitivity analysis, we need to do this when we work on the project risks, etc. So when we do the sensitivity analysis, one of the things that we use is a tornado diagram. And tornado diagram actually helps us in doing the sensitivity analysis. So when we do the tornado diagram, that is more relevant. I'm just going to give you a brief idea about this one. So when you work on the risk, one of the diagrams or one of the things that we work on is the tornado diagram. So if you compare the other options, the more relevant is the tornado. But you could get confused with the sensitivity diagram. There is nothing like a sensitivity diagrams as such that we draw here. Data flow are definitely not relevant because data flow diagram objective is different altogether. That's not for sensitivity. Decision tree is again, the objective is different. So those two options are ruled out very clearly. There could be a confusion between sensitivity diagram and a tornado diagram. But sensitivity diagram, as I mentioned, there is nothing like a sensitivity diagram as such. So the only correct option is tornado diagram here when we do the sensitivity analysis. So you can read more on this, and we did cover this as a part of training as well. Let's take another example here to solve. This example helps in calculating SPI. Now, if you take this example a bit closely, you'll find that what all things are given here. So if SPI is 0.75, CPI is zero point 0.8, that means you are actually spending more money than budgeted and you're also behind the schedule on this project. Then which of the following report is correct? So schedule variance, cost variance, TCPI. Now, if you take a look at schedule variance example, cost variance example, the one option is to calculate schedule variance, cost variance, right? So we need to also take a look at whether we have enough information or not. So SPI is nothing but earned value divided by the planned value. The CPI is nothing but earned value divided by the actual cost. So you can put them into these formulas and try and calculate that. And the TCPI is another option over here. But if you take a look at the example of the TCPI, we might not have everything to calculate the TCPI. I have already told you about TCPI. So there are two options to calculate that. So based on the BAC and based on the estimated completion. But here we are talking about not having enough data. And therefore, the option is the last one, which is the project is likely need more money than planned to complete. So as I mentioned, considering this particular progress, definitely project needs more money because none of these outputs will be correct when you will calculate it actually. All right. So sometimes you'll find this kind of a confusing options that are given. And if you don't get your calculations right, sometimes those calculations are not relevant or not required. Sometimes enough information is not given in the example itself in order to calculate some of these variances. So in that scenario, we need to apply our mind and see what else is it there. Let's move to the next question then. According to PMBOK, project management process are organized into which of the following order of process groups? So I had taken you through the process groups already. So I'm sure you must have been very clear now. The answer is the third one. We talk about initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So I did cover the process group, processes, and the knowledge areas. So you can relate to that. The other things are very clear cut, the ones that we need to eliminate. So such a questions, you should get it right in order to score in the exam. We can't afford to miss on these questions actually. Let's move on then. Which of the following statements is true regarding negative float? So we have positive float, we have negative float. So we talk about negative float. That means, of course, we are, as you can see, float is that much of time we get to complete the activity, extra time that we get. But we're talking about negative float. That means we're actually behind the time here. So if we are behind the time, so let's see what options would then be best suitable here. The first is the project manager should try to recover negative float by crashing or fast tracking. Next is there cannot be any negative float in the project. The project manager should try to remove negative float by reducing scope. It is desirable to have negative float in the project. So some of these couple of options cannot have a float or desirable. That can be ruled out very clearly here. And project managers should try to remove negative float by reducing scope. Again, we can't reduce scope. The project manager doesn't have authority to remove scope. So the only option that is available here is the crashing and fast tracking. So if you remember, we discussed about crashing and fast tracking. So fast tracking is where we actually start working parallelly, and crashing is where we put more resources. So since we are talking about negative float, we are actually behind the schedule. That means we should crash the project or fast track in order to move faster on the project. Let's move to the next question. Which of the following represent a set of conditions that should be satisfied before deliverables are accepted? I'm sure this question you should again get it very right. We're talking about fulfilling the set of conditions before we deploy or before we deliver to the customer. So first, of course, deliverable list, which doesn't talk about the set of condition as such. Test plan has nothing to do with it. Punch list again is completely different outlier here in terms of the options that are given. So in terms of setup conditions to be fulfilled before we deliver is the acceptance criteria, and hence that's the correct answer. So that's how we can go by eliminating the incorrect options in order to arrive at the right answer. If you know straightforward, then you can save time, and straightforward you can select and move ahead. Let's move on to the next question then. How will a Pareto chart will help in project with a lot of identified action items? Now, if you remember Pareto chart, it covers about 80-20 rule. So as we say that 20% reasons are responsible for 80% problems. So if you know those 20% reasons, then that will definitely help you. For what? Understand the trend of deviations. Again, I see that completely different reason. Prioritization, complete all activities on time, identify root cause. So identify root cause is definitely one thing. Another thing is the prioritization. But here we're talking about identified actions. Pareto charts are also used for identifying root cause, but we're not talking about here problems. We're talking about here we have list of actions that are identified. So that means the correct answer is prioritization. So if we have list of actions that are identified, that means what is more relevant now is to prioritize these actions so that we can perform and we can get started with it. Let's move to the next question then. The activity relationship between the start of cleaning and start of digging is represented by which of the following? So we have various activity relationships. Let's take a quick look at some of these activity relationships. How do they look like? We did cover this as a part of training. I'm sure you will recall it. But just so that we can, just for this particular question, if you take a look at the activity relationships, we have finish to start. Okay, so here we can talk about finish to start. So unless we finish the first activity, we can't start the second one. So here we have finish to finish activity. So we can finish the first and we can also finish the second activity. Here we have got the start to finish. All right, so you can start working on the first activity. You can start the second activity before we finish the second one. And the another one is start to start. So we can actually start both activities together. So if you take a look at this cleaning and digging, it's pretty straightforward now. All right, so we can certainly think of start to start relationships over here. Let's talk about schedule variance. Schedule variance is what? I think we did cover this multiple times. So schedule variance is this always affect the cost variance, never affects cost variance. A negative value means that project will likely to be delayed. Now we'll talk about variance. A positive value means that the project will likely to be delayed. So if you talk about schedule variance, it covers about the earned value minus the planned value. So if the planned value is more than the earned value is less, that means you're negative. So that means you're behind the schedule. So negative value means that the project will likely to be delayed is the right answer here if you take a look at some of these options. So if you know the formula, you can certainly arrive at the right option. That means. Okay, let's move on to the next question. You are currently working as project manager in Reality Logistics. You have been given responsibility for moving infrastructure of ABC Software Limited to a new location. For that, you need to identify the stakeholders of your project based on the power interest grid that you have created. Which of the following types of stakeholders expectation should be managed closely? Now, we did cover this earlier as well. If you remember the stakeholder matrix, we spoke about we need to manage closely those stakeholders who have got high power and high interest. So you can recall that and you should be able to then answer this question very clearly. Moving to the next question then, what is the company-wide policy which mandates all project quality known as? If you talk about company-wide policy, now ISO 9000 is not a company-wide policy, or quality planning is we talk about planning the quality in the project. Quality control is again something which we do at a project level. But when we talk about quality policy, that is at the organization level. So you'll find here clear-cut difference between the company-wide policy and something that is done at a project level or something that is just the generic standard like ISO. So quality policy is definitely at a company-wide level. Next question is, which one of the following describes the difference between a standard and a deviation accurately? We're talking about here standards and a deviation accurately. So standards are optional, but regulations are not. So we're talking about here difference between regulation and the standards. Standards are mandatory, but regulations are not. Regulations are mandatory, but standards may be seen as guidelines. Regulations and standards are essentially the same. So in this question, we are essentially talking about standards and the regulations. Now standards, if you talk about standards, I don't think so standards are mandatory. No, it's always good to follow standards. Therefore, you must have seen examples like CMMI standards. Your company is MMI level 5 or level 3 or level 4. That is something which is done voluntarily. It's good to follow. Or we follow coding standards, good to do. Or we follow the different standards like ISO standards, which are good to do. But what about regulations? I don't think so. It's something which is mandatory. If you're working in banking, there are certain regulations like SOX compliance or BCBS regulations. If you are in healthcare, there are certain regulations that are to be followed as part of the healthcare. If you're in insurance, there are certain regulations that are needs to be followed from IRDA point of view, etc. So that means regulations are mandatory, but standards are not mandatory. That's pretty clear here. Let's move on to another setup example here. What will be the BAC, which is budget at completion of your project, if it has a CPI, cost performance index of 0.80 and estimated completion of the number that is given. Okay, so that's in dollar. So let's talk about this particular example. So what I've done basically is that I have copied this example here so that we can calculate it. So we are talking about here the budget at completion. So for budget at completion, what can we do? So BAC. So we have few numbers here very clearly. So we have got the CPI of 0.8 and we have got the EAC as well. So when we calculate the budget at completion, what you have to do is I just have to multiply zero point 0.8 by the EAC, which is estimated completion, and what I get is the budget at completion. So in this case, the budget at completion will come to the second option, right? So if you multiply zero point 0.8 by the EAC, what you will get is the budget at completion. So if you remember that formula, then it's pretty straightforward for you to calculate the budget at completion. Let's move to the next question then. The best way of making an accurate forecasting of ETC, which is estimate to complete, is now this question we need to discuss a bit more in terms of the options that are given. So we have got various options. One is how can we arrive at estimate to complete? So we have budget at completion, which is planned at the beginning. We can just minus whatever the cost that is incurred at that given point in time, and whatever is remaining is your estimate to complete. Or we can have estimate at completion minus the actual cost. Or we can use the straightforward formula which is given in the last option. So all these are based on the trends, based on the actual cost and the trends. But in terms of getting accurate estimation, we can't just rely on the trend. So we have to also factor in various aspects, and we can play around with those options. And therefore, the manual way of doing it will give you much accurate number here from ETC point of view. And therefore, that's the option here. Moving to the next question, how will you assess a situation where 6 observations are within the upper control limit and control line where the 7th observation is observed within upper control limit and control line? So here, I think it's pretty straightforward. If you remember the control chart is something that we covered as a part of this training. And control charts talks about if anything is outlier, anything is outside of the control limits, then the process is out of control. So we talk about the various causes here, assignable causes or normal causes or rule of 7. So some of those concepts are basically covered as a part of the control chart. So this is something which is used even for the root cause analysis or when we work on the problems, etc. Even in Six Sigma process improvement also we use the control charts. The other question is about some different topic. Which of the following can be used for trend analysis? So we have control charts, we have cause and effect diagram, we have run charts, and we have Pareto. So Pareto we spoke about, that's 80-20 used for identifying the root cause or prioritization, etc. Cause and effect is used mainly for the root cause analysis. Control charts I just spoke about is used for the root cause analysis as well as for the process improvement, etc. Now here we're talking about trend analysis. So trend analysis, then the only option is run charts. Run charts are the ones that are used for trend analysis. For example, what is the server capacity utilization trend over the past 6 months? Okay, so we can easily do the trend analysis based on the data that is gathered. Next question talks about in which of theory Douglas MacGregor has defined 2 models of worker behavior. And I'm sure you'll agree here that theory X and theory Y is what we talk about. So theory X and theory Y, which is defined by the MacGregor's theory, and I would like you to read about theory X and theory Y in order to understand what is the belief of the theory X managers and what is the belief of the theory Y managers. Moving from there, something which we did cover a bit, what are the 3 I's of stakeholder? So I did cover that when we were speaking about the stakeholder matrix. So we talk about interest, we talk about influence, we talk about impact. So very clearly, the option number 2 is correct here. Interest, influence, and impact. And based on that, we decide the response strategy in order to manage the stakeholders effectively. The next question talks about which of the following is the objective of conducting bidder conference. So when we conduct bidder conference, why do we do that? If you take a look at some of these options, is like to make sure that all questions from potential sellers are answered privately. I don't think so we do that for answering questions privately. It's a conference, so everybody's there, so that is ruled out. To make sure that potential sellers are treated as per the type of questions asked. So again, I don't see this is completely relevant at all. Okay, so this talks about something else completely. The last is to ensure that all parties get answers to their questions. So that is definitely good. But the other option is to make sure that all potential sellers are treated equally and have access to the same information. So sometimes the last option and the third option may look a bit close, but the third option talks about few other objectives, and therefore that is the correct option here. Let's move to the next question then. What is the Japanese method of modern quality management called, which relies on continuing small improvements involving everyone from the top management to the lowest level of worker in the organization? Now, if you talk about Kanban, Kanban really talks about making things visible, big visible charts, making process explicit, all of that. So it's about signboards. It doesn't talk about the small improvements. If you talk about Deming cycle, which is PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. So that's another way altogether. And PDCA is nothing but Deming cycle only. So the only option that is left is the Kaizens, and Kaizen is nothing but the small improvements. Okay, so moving on then, Hensberg divided motivation factors into two classes, satisfiers and dissatisfiers. Which of the following are example of satisfiers? So if you take a look at some of these options, you'll find that from Hensberg theory point of view, sense of personal achievement and work satisfaction is what will satisfy the workers more. It's not about plush office space or performance-based salary. It's not about work satisfaction or fringe benefits. It's not about vacation time, assignment of personal staff assistants, etc. It's about the personal achievement and the work satisfaction as per Hensberg. So this covers all the questions as a part of today's session. And I'm sure these questions that we covered as part of today's session must have given you a fair idea about mixed kind of questions that are asked in the PMP examination. Some of them are scenario based, some of them are pretty straightforward questions, and some of them are the examples which we have to actually solve by remembering some of the formulas that we have covered. So this session must have given you a fair idea about the questions from the PMP exam point of view. Some of these questions could also be asked during the project management interview. The different scenarios that we covered actually are also covered as a part of the project management interview, project manager's interview, when you will go and appear for that. So objective of session was definitely to give you a fair idea about the kind of questions that you will have to face in the exam and in the interview. So I would like to also appeal you all to go through the other videos that are uploaded. We have uploaded quite a few videos on PMP recently, and I would like you all to refer to some of those videos, and those are on various topics. You'll get good idea about the way we deliver training program and how those videos will give you a lot of insights into the examination, PMP examination, as well as various topics that are covered as part of examination. So with this, I wish you all the best for your PMP certification examination, and thank you for participating in the training.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!